Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for our first webinar related to Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, the Wheat Cluster. And while I say good morning, I'm very aware that now it has changed to afternoon here in Manitoba. So welcome. My name is Lori-Ann Kaminski. I'm the Research Program Manager for cereal crops in Manitoba with the Manitoba Crop Alliance. And I also sit on the board of directors with the Canadian Wheat Research Coalition. And I will be your moderator for today's webinar. And before we get started, I wanted to quickly run through some housekeeping things. All participants are muted for today's webinar. And if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which should be available at the bottom of your screen. We'll hold all questions until the end of the webinar and answer them then. Today's webinar will focus on Priority 1 of the latest Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership Cluster, which is about climate change and the environment. We are pleased to have 3 researchers join us today to talk about their research activities in more depth and how the anticipated outcomes will support the climate environmental work that growers have already been doing, and how that has advantages for your farm operations. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, starting with Dr. Brian Barris. Dr. Barris is a senior research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Lethbridge, and adjunct professor at the University of Alberta. Dr. Barris leads several multidisciplinary projects developing G by E by M crop management systems. His impact on academia and industry has been recognized on several occasions, including Alberta Seed Growers Honorary Life Award, Canadian Journal of Plant Science Best Paper, Canadian Journal of Plant Science Outstanding Associated Editor, and a fellow with the Canadian Society of Agronomy. Dr. Barris publishes in areas of agronomy and crop science and has been the author and co-author of 122 peer-reviewed research articles. He's also edited books and 2 book chapters. He served as editor-in-chief for the Canadian Journal of Plant Science and special issues editor for Frontiers of Plant Science. Dr. Barris has several international collaborations and represents Canada on the research committee of the Wheat Initiative, where he also developed the inaugural chair of an expert working group for global agronomic wheat research. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thanks, that was a mouthful.
He's a busy guy. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Kate Congreves, who is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Sciences and the Yaroslavsky and BMO Research Chair in Regenerative Agriculture at the University of Saskatchewan. She is an award-winning researcher and teacher and the author of over 50 peer-reviewed publications. Kate's research program is focused on understanding nitrogen flows, cycling, and losses in crop production systems. The long-term vision is widespread implementation of sustainable nitrogen management for a resilient agriculture industry. Thanks for joining us today, Kate. Our final speaker will be Dr. Mario Tenuta, who is a senior industrial chair in 4R nutrient management and a professor of soil ecology at the University of Manitoba. His training includes Bachelor of Science in Botany and Physical Geography, a Master of Science in Soil Fertility, and a PhD in Plant Pathology and postdoctoral research in Nematology. The 4R Industrial Research Chair Program is advancing research in 4R nitrogen management practices to give farmers and industry solutions to achieving nitrous oxide emission reductions and improved soil health and crop productivity. A key feature of the chair program is conducting farm-based research with particular attention to outreach of those farmers, of those findings to farmers, industry, and from the University of Manitoba. The Applied Ecology Lab, under the leadership of Dr. Mario Tenuta, has highly productive and impactful research programs with several important foci: soil ecology, nematology, and the relationship between nutrient management and greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks for joining us today, Mario. So we'll dive right in with the first presentation from Dr. Barras. So I can see you now, and were you going to bring some slides up?
Well, that was the plan.
There they are. They're coming.
Are they there?
They're arriving. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hopefully we don't get glitchy here. That's been a common theme with Zoom the last couple days. Well, thanks, Lorianne, and thanks to CWRC for the invitation to speak today. And we're obviously not going to cover a whole bunch of results since we just started, but today's just an introduction and a bit of background of how we got here with this particular study, which was kind of a journey, actually. So the piece that I'm heading up, we've entitled Role of Wheat Growth Habit in Reducing GHG Emissions and Fostering Climate Resiliency without compromising yield quality and 4R principles. And this is a pan-prairie project led by myself, and the tech teams, which are critical, are all in brackets here. Ben Ellard out of Lethbridge is a soil scientist. He's doing some cool work on tracing technology to try and pin down with a little more accuracy the nitrogen use, where it goes. Dr. Jing Hao was a longtime collaborator with me in winter wheat and some of the spring wheat. We're still filling her position. Winter wheat breeder, giving us some advice there. Arwinder Sidhu. Kui Lu is the co-PI of this because I don't know, my days might be numbered given how old I feel. So he's going to help out there. Mervyn St. Louis, soil scientist, both at Swift Current. Hiroshi Kubota, relatively new agronomist out of Lacombe. Ramona Moore, longtime collaborator out of Manitoba, being supported by Steve Crittenden, Aaron Glenn, and Santosh Kumar. And then one of our final collaborators and a co-lead on this whole project, Mario Tenuta, running the carbon site out of the University of Manitoba. And then Guillermo Hernandez Ramirez, we've been working together for a few years now, and he's going to be doing the GHG work out of Lacombe. Okay, so a bit of background. We've been doing quite a bit of work, obviously, as an agronomist with nitrogen and how it impacts yield, the economic consequences of those sources, and how they react when we try to integrate it all with other cropping systems. And this was the most recent project. And we were able to train a master's student out of that, Adam Fass, and he had a publication on the piece that was really around enhanced efficiency fertilizers and rates. And then my biologist, ZZ Wang, headed up the sort of the timing placement type piece to that project as well. And then kind of a cool one, if there's any consultants and whatnot on here, is that Eric Brimmer was approached by, I think it was the Crop Science Society of America, or one of them, to summarize our work in winter wheat and spring wheat. And if you go to this article, there's a quiz at the end, and you get some CEUs out of it if you complete it. And so what did we learn, like in the context of, research priorities and climate policy? Well, obviously we know, and we didn't state it first, but nitrification inhibitors can really reduce our GHG emissions. And actually, our project, other projects nationally, globally, show that we can reduce it by at least 30%, which is the target, the federal mandated target to try and get back to 1990 levels. Now, the magnitude wasn't great, but there's no magnitude stated in that target either. So this is good news, and that's a single practice towards, buffering us around the context of climate change with one practice. And so is there more we can do? And can we on the research side be more efficient in predicting the implication of those practices on GHG emissions? And this is why I think some of the work that Ben's doing is going to really complement the work that we do with our chamber methods of GHG emission work by targeting microdoses of 15N tracer technology. Personal opinion, the return on investments into things like N-fixing crops, like N-fixing wheat, I don't think that's a strong proposition compared to, or before we really nail down the physiology and how that impacts and improves our breeding efficiency around nutrient use efficiency, and all within that goal of a systems approach, not a silo approach of enhancing and fostering this principle of genetics by environment by management systems work. And Captain Obvious, if we really want to reduce the carbon footprint, we've got to find a different alternative to the Haber-Bosch program. So that's my take on lessons we've learned in this context. The other thing that we've been doing that I thought might be time to integrate with nitrogen, particularly in this climate resiliency context, is ultra-early wheat seeding. So abandoning the idea of calendar dates and sort of the cultural, granddad did it this way, I'm doing it this way, I'm not seeding wheat until I get all my peas in, blah, 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 to sort of just using soil temperature in the top 2 inches as a soil trigger to begin with planting. And so that can occur, the earliest we've gone based on that prescriptive approach of starting at 0. The sweet spot is 1 to 3, but we start at 0. That can occur here in Lethbridge as early as February 9th. And but that said, we've been as far north as Dawson Creek, BC with this project, and we've got about 50 plus site years now to show that it works. It doesn't work every year at every location, but it works more than we thought it would. So that's kind of the background. That's what brought us to this component of this project. We're both this component and then the component Mario is leading is just trying to get an improved understanding from a pan prairie perspective of the implications of nitrogen management and that interplay with the most modern genetics of wheat. And just trying to get our methodology at the same time dialed in as much as we can. And of course, lastly, it's all about economics, and more so now than ever. So that'll be kind of the last sort of culminating exercise with this project. So what do we know about winter wheat? Well, we know traditionally in the prairies, at least, winter wheat will yield 20 to 25% more than bread wheat or CWRS. And why is that? It's not the life cycle, which is in blue here for winter wheat and green here for spring wheat. It's this thing right here, this critical growth period, starting at sort of stem elongation and just past flowering. And the critical key thing here that really helps winter wheat is that that's completed, as you can see, in spring, whereas wheat, if you plant late, particularly, a big chunk of that's now in summertime. And that's not a good thing, because anything over 30 degrees really kills our seed set. And that's kind of the advantage of the physiological, biological basis behind ultra early planting, is we can shift that critical growth period out of July. And that's when we see the advantage. So we're at a minimum protecting yield, quite often improving it. And so the question in this context of this study is like, where does ultra early fit in terms of a yield benchmark against winter wheat? And so this is our results from 2024 at Lethbridge. And conventional planting, you can see, is kind of that you're losing that 20% advantage, or winter wheat has that 20% advantage over CWRS. But if you go ultra early, now you have a situation where the difference is not significant anymore. And this is just an average of our dry land and our irrigated results, more prominent in the dry land result. And then, yeah, we've started doing our GHG work too. And really what we learned previously, at least the assumption, was that winter wheat probably didn't flux off as much as spring wheat. But so far, with the snapshot of 2024, winter wheat is actually fluxing off more than our spring wheat systems. And we're starting to see, as we've seen in other studies too, where the nitrification inhibitors, generally speaking, are pulling down and reducing our emissions. And pretty good successful establishment at the locations this year. Swift Current, I think this might be Mario's group up top here in the corners. Swift Current, the other pictures. And so just a big shout out to our funders here, Alberta Grains, Manitoba Crop Alliance, and Sask Wheat, along with obviously Ag Canada, and the leveraging that they're providing through the Sustainable Canada Ag Partnership. Thank you.
Unmute. Sorry. Thanks, Brian, for that introduction. We're just going to roll through to our next speaker, and but save your questions, jot them down, or drop them into the chat, and we'll get around to that. So we'll move over to Kate, Dr. Kate Congreves. Over to you, Kate. Thank you.
Great. And can you see my screen there, Lorianne?
Yes. We
Great.
see your whole screen, not your presentation mode at this stage.
Okay, I think that's okay. I think that's how it's going to be today. So, yeah, so it's should be fully enlarged there. Okay, so I'll provide an update on the Climate Smart Resilient Wheat project. And the main first point I want to mention here is I'm presenting this really on behalf of the lead, which is Dr. Curtis Posniak. So Dr. Curtis Posniak, he's a professor here at University of Saskatchewan with the Crop Development Center, as well as the Department of Plant Sciences. And he's a geneticist and integrates with crop breeding as well. And we also have Dr. Randy Kuchar, also with the Department of Plant Sciences and Crop Development Center here at the University of Saskatchewan. And he brings the pathology expertise component of this research program. And then myself, I'm Kate Congreves, same department, and I bring the nitrogen components. So this slide deck is a combination of material supplied by both Randy and Curtis. So it's a just general overview of the project here. The goal is to get ahead and mitigate some climate change losses for the Canadian wheat industry. And so we do have three main pillars. The first is tackling improving nitrogen use efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second pillar here is aimed at specifically reducing losses due to heat and drought stress. And then the third is aimed at improving disease resistance. And so I'll just walk you through each component. So we've got a nitrogen component here. So the nitrogen component, this is utilizing the N15 enrichment technique. So we can use N15 as a tracer. And O'Brien mentioned that they do a similar thing with Ben Ellert. And so I'll just walk you through what this is. So we're looking at assessing the genetic variability of many wheat lines and the ability to recover nitrogen fertilizer that's been added to the system. And so this is both for spring wheat and durum wheat. So if you produce wheat, that wheat plant is accessing nitrogen from the fertilizer that was applied, but also from mineral N that's already sitting in the soil in inorganic form, and also from anything that was mineralized during the growing season from that organic nitrogen pool. And so when you assess nitrogen use efficiency using basic metrics, it's really difficult to parse out how much fertilizer how much nitrogen is attributed to that fertilizer that plant acquired. But when we use the N15 technique here, we can actually specifically attribute nitrogen that has been derived from that fertilizer that was applied and start to look at nitrogen use efficiency with this tracer technique. So that's what we've been doing in collaboration with Curtis and his team here. So here's some photos from the research trial laid out this summer. We have over 133 genetic lines out in the field that we've dosed with N15 enriched fertilizer, and we're able to track the N15 into that spring wheat. And of course, we measure and we trace that N15 from that fertilizer dose that's been applied all the way to harvest. We look at it in the grain, in the plant straw. We also assess how much fertilizer would have been remaining in the soil. So we go through lots of plant and soil sampling here. And then we'll just show you a few photos of the work that happens behind the scenes. So a lot of those samples have been processed, and you have to process them finally down prior to preparing them for N15 analysis. And so we do that on site here. And we have the isotope ratio mass spec here so that we can measure how much N derived from that fertilizer ends up in the wheat plant. An example of the results that we're working towards is looking at the genetic variability of the plants to acquire that nitrogen derived from that fertilizer and start to assess the potential and screen for lines that indicate improved potential for acquiring nitrogen derived from the fertilizer. So this is part agronomic, but also part genetic in terms of combination and integrating with the geneticists here and their ability to look at the genetic loci that might be responsible for specific traits. So this is just a snapshot of the results that we expect to make progress on over last year, this year, and then in the future years coming up. And then we'll layer on a component in further years where we're looking at nitrous oxide emissions as well. So I'll move on to Dr. Pozniak's component here, which is assessing heat and drought stress. And so what's been done so far is we've established 2 GWAS panels in the field to assess for both heat and drought related traits. And so we've panels for spring wheat as well as durum. And this photo here has been stitched together with UAV photography, where you were looking at the canopy temperature at flowering. It's a really crucial period for developing heat resistance for, so they've been focusing on that. And they've been using drone techniques and imaging to look for heat stress with the different stress responses of a stressed leaf versus a healthy leaf. So this work is underway in Dr. Pozniak's group. An example of the results so far is the ability to predict yield differences under heat stress using different models. So they're working towards developing those predictive models and linking their observed and measured phenotypic traits for resistance or ability to withstand some of that heat and drought stress, and then move forward with some of the predictive models to link to some of the genetic analysis that they're doing. I'll also cover Dr. Randy Kucher's component on disease. So the main thrust here is to assess germplasm for resistance to major diseases of concern, which includes Fusarium head blight, as well as bacterial leaf streak. And so here's some field photos from that Dr. Kucher provided for me ahead of this webinar of inoculation and scoring at the nursery trials that were conducted in 2024. And also an example of their scores and their checks, and they're looking for severity for example, Fusarium head blight in this scenario. So this is just an example of the type of work and progress that's been made for 2024. And ultimately, the goal is to move towards genetic analyses as well as cultivar development, or the information needed for further cultivar development, to identify the potential and make progress to improve upon cultivars, for example, their ability to use nitrogen, or the ability to withstand heat and drought stress, or the disease-resistant capacity. Okay. So with that, I'll pass it over to Miriam.
Sounds good, thank you. Again, I'll just encourage people to jot down your questions or drop them in the chat. Up next, Dr. Mario Tenuta. If you're ready, Mario, you can go ahead.
Can you see my slides there, Lorianne?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you, Lorianne. Thank you, the Research Coalition. for being invited to talk here on our Agri-Science Wheat Cluster project. A prairie assessment of nitrogen stabilizers and split fertilizer applications sustaining spring wheat yield, protein, production economics while reducing nitrous oxide emissions. A long title, but not such a complicated study. So there are the main co-investigators. I'm the PI, and there's co-investigators: Merv St. Louis, Brian Barris, Guillermo Hernandez Ramirez, Hiroshi Kubota, William May, or often known as Bill May, and Tristan Skolerud. And as you can see, quite a few institutions, organizations across the prairies involved, which is fantastic. We really kind of need to do that to enable to cover the wide geography and have some people with particular skills in agronomy and economics as well. Now, the objectives of the project is to have a pan prairie field study, so to examine across the prairies for the benefit of combinations of split application of nitrogen fertilizer, in this case, granular urea, in most cases. The second application of nitrogen will be a UAN solution. Inhibitor treated urea. So the nitrogen being added is inhibited. We'll get more in details on that a little bit later. And reducing the rate of nitrogen addition, okay, on the agronomic performance and reduction in N2O, nitrous oxide emissions from Canadian Western red spring wheat. And specifically, the questions are: can split application of urea, in other words, 60% banded at planting, 40% top dressed as UAN as a stream or dribble, can they reduce emissions without compromising yield and protein? Can urease and nitrification inhibitors reduce emissions of nitrous oxide without compromising the timely availability of nitrogen to the crop? I'll explain a little bit more about that in the next slide. If increased nitrogen utilization efficiency affords reduced fertilizer nitrogen application rates to cover the incremental cost of split and inhibitor usage. So this is more on the economic side to see really if protecting the nitrogen, reducing losses, allows us to rethink the nitrogen application rates and actually adjust those rates, because we're not having losses to be lower, saving money for the farmer, or at least covering the cost of the 4R practices, and at the same time having the benefits of reduced nitrogen in terms of for losses in the environment. Now, how did we get here for this project? Well, here in Manitoba, we've extensively studied dual inhibitors and polymer-coated urea for just about since around 2010, when we started examining. We have quite extensive amount of information on this in various soils, different years in terms of climate and so forth. And we also examined, but sorry, I should mention, but we did this in Manitoba, and we've had collaborators with Rich Farrell at the U of S, and the split application of nitrogen at planting and at early growing season, we've shown to reduce nitrous oxide emissions without compromising yield for grain corn, processing potato, and canola in Manitoba. However, this approach of split application, to our knowledge, hadn't been examined in spring wheat in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan for reductions in N2O. So we wanted to extend to very, very prominent crop, obviously, for the prairies. Another aspect that got us going with this project is producers are dubious. They're skeptical of split application because they think that it could reduce spring wheat yield, particularly in semi-arid regions where the nitrogen may get hung up at the surface and the roots are down below, and if there's not rain, the nitrogen just won't get to the roots. Okay, but we need to examine this if this is truly an issue. Here, in this case, we want to go a little bit earlier, quite early in our split application to reduce the chance of that happening. Another aspect is nitrification inhibitors alone with urea are not eligible for the off-calf support program through the various provincial organizations that are partnered with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to provide the program for incentives. Dual inhibitors are eligible, but single nitrification inhibitors aren't. And there's a long story behind that I've been working with, but the bottom line is we just need to show more data on the nitrification inhibitors. We've had quite a bit in Manitoba, but not as much elsewhere. So that's the idea of the project: get across the prairies to get an assessment. Now the sites and investigators. Lethbridge, Brian is the lead there, with a great support team there at Ag Canada in terms of technicians. At Swift Current, Merv St. Luce is the lead with support by his team there, Katie and Kelsey. And at Lacombe, Hiroshi Kubota is the lead. And Guillermo Hernandez Ramirez from the University of Alberta is analyzing the gases for the Lacombe site. And Hiroshi's got lots of technicians and support there at Ag Canada. At Indian Head, Bill May is the lead, and Chamara and Rebecca are the technicians working on the project. And here in Manitoba, I'm the lead, and I'm supported by a phenomenal team: Brad, Marlies, Emma, Nick, and Je. Now, the last component is pretty exciting for us, and that's the economics. This is really going to kick in with Tristan Skolrud from the University of Saskatchewan later on in the project, once we start having more data. And this is going to be a really, really exciting part, and see how these 4Rs practices pay off or not pay off. Are they robbing profit? Are they improving profit? How we can make them break even in terms of the cost, in terms of not penalizing producers on potential profit margins by the extra cost, for example, of the premium of the inhibitors, for example, or the cost of that second application, okay, for the split. And here are our treatments, quite an extensive list. Urea is our fertilizer, nitrogen for the at planting treatments. So we have no inhibitor treatments at 3 rates: 70, 90, 100% recommended nitrogen for spring wheat. We have with inhibitor, nitrification inhibitor alone at planting, and here we're using Entrench, which is nitropyrin. It's a product by Corteva that we've shown to be extremely effective. And Brian was just showing as well data that Entrench is very effective as well. And then we have the split applications, where we have the controls of just the urea and the UAN splits with no inhibitor. And then we have with inhibitors, where it's a nitrification inhibitor with the urea planting, and then a urea volatilization inhibitor, because that's the target with the split, because it's left at the surface, is to have a urease inhibitor to prevent ammonia volatilization. In this case, the product from Coke, which is Anglo. Here's some great images that Chimera shared with us from the Indian Head site. And so you can see these are the chambers. Everybody has slightly different chambers. We have 2 chambers per plot, manually sampled over several times to get emission fluxes. We're also tracking, monitoring ammonia emissions using dosimeter tubes over here. And they had a great site at Indian Head in 2024. Should mention 4-year project. We just completed the first year in 2024. Let's go to Swift Current. This is the drier of the sites that I have data. We have data so far, and you see very low emissions here. There's not much overall going on, but there's still nevertheless treatment differences, where the urea alone at planting has the most emissions, particularly mid-period here. And then where we have Entrench at planting, that nitrification inhibitor, you can see it's quite reduced. That's pretty phenomenal. If we look at the split application, less N2O emissions just with the split application versus the blue, at planting. So even without the inhibitors, split application is doing its trick. And I'll explain why. Usually it's wetter early on in the season, you get more N2O emissions. So if you split apply, you're applying that nitrogen jolt later on when the soil's drier. Okay. And here's the inhibitor split with Anvil included in the urease inhibitor. Interesting, popped up there. So we have to see, it could just be variability. But you can see, the split was working even at Swift Current, which was drier and low emissions. We're still seeing the treatment difference, and we're still seeing the benefit of the inhibitor. So that's fantastic. Moving a little bit east, a little bit wetter conditions, higher fluxes, and this is at Indian Head. Again, the urea, fairly large in terms of emissions. Now the split here cranks up after the split. That's interesting, and I think it's because there was a rainfall that occurred just there. So that kind of makes sense. If there wasn't a rainfall, that probably would have been low. So it's a bit of hit and miss going on. And if we look at the entrench at planting, quite low. In here, it's the dotted line. And then with the entrench and anvil, lower, but there's still that spike up here. So anyway, very interesting things. And the yield differences here, we can see the highest N produced the highest yield generally, except for in the split here. Interesting, the lowest nitrogen produced the most years. No stats here, of course, just 1 year data. So, we need to compile data for a number of years for a site and then also across years. In Manitoba, much higher emissions here, and the same thing, the urea alone, the highest emissions, urea and entrenched nitrification inhibitor, lower emissions, the split, lower emissions, except later on, we got some more emissions. There would have been a rainfall right around here. Okay, and yeah, so surprisingly common patterns for diverse geographies here and magnitudes of emissions. So quite shocking, actually, surprising. That's pretty awesome. We haven't had access to this kind of results and information across the prairies at the same time. So this is pretty excellent. So like to say thanks to the Wheat Coalition, Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Alberta Grains, Sask Wheat, Manitoba Crop Alliance, and Lorianne, if I'm missing anybody else that is contributing here, please let me know, okay? Great, thanks.
Thanks, Mario. We've had a few questions come in to the chat. For Brian, can you comment on the effect of early seeded spring wheat on yield in general? Does it get closer to winter wheat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way we position ultra early seeding is that at a minimum it protects yield. But generally what we see when you start doing orthogonal contrast with your data is there's always this downward linear trend as seeding is delayed in terms of yield. In like the snapshot from Lethbridge this year, this is the first time we've compared it to winter wheat, and regular conventional seeding was still that 20-25% lower with respect to CWRS versus winter wheat. But if you adopted the practice of ultra early seeding, the yield difference between the winter wheat and the spring wheat was actually non-significant. So we do close that yield gap between winter wheat and spring wheat with this practice. And and that's why we were interested in that, is like, now trying to, from the context of climate resiliency, a practice that on the seeding side that can buffer against climate change. Now you've got potential enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and how does that interplay with growth habit? And so that's a real nice piece that complements, the other activity 6 that Mario's leading, where we're trying to do a pan prairie assessment of diving into the timing and placement strategies around that and how all that has implications for emissions.
Yeah, thanks. A question for Kate. What was the indices, or what were the indices that you captured from the UAV? Was it canopy temperature?
So for the Curtis's component on heat and drought stress, we have a variety of traits that were captured with the UAV. There is canopy temperature at flowering. That one slide that I did show, that was of canopy temperature at flowering. And we also have like indices corrected throughout physiological maturity, from the 2-leaf stage all the way to physiological maturity at weekly intervals. Yeah, and then there is a component in terms of Curtis's work on looking at stems and stem sample collection for soluble carbohydrates as well. Yeah.
Thanks. So multiple indices, I guess, is the answer there. Another question for Kate. I'm quoting, did I understand the N15 work was to establish which varieties mine the soil better for nutrients, or on the other hand, which varieties can't and require all applied nutrients?
So a couple things here. When you're working with N15, so we're specifically the tracer component is of the fertilizer that's applied. And so this technique enables us to look at genetic differences, potential genetic differences in their ability to acquire inorganic N that has been sourced from that fertilizer that's been applied. Okay, so application of fertilizer, it's a source of inorganic N in the soil, and you can trace that N15 all the way into the plant and measure where it ends up being allocated at harvest, how much gets into the grain. So you can also, to flesh out that answer, you can also, in doing that, understand how much nitrogen was mined from the soil as well, in using that technique. So you can look at fertilizer-derived nitrogen contributions and how they made their way into the grain, but you can also look at the relative importance of soil-derived nitrogen and how it made its way into the grain as well. So you have the ability to access both. In terms of fertilizer management, we're particularly interested in crops that have that strong ability to acquire the nitrogen that was directly applied from that fertilizer. And if there's a genetic difference of that, then you work with the breeders and the geneticists to uncover what's responsible for that. What are the mechanisms that are responsible for driving those differences? And is there ability to breed for that? Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question for Mario. Are you measuring the NH3 volatilization with nitrification inhibitors? I think the reason why OFCAF doesn't include nitrification inhibitors is because they are worried about pollution swapping. That was a question and a comment, I guess.
Right. Yes. Thanks, Roland. Yes, we are measuring ammonia. It's qualitative. So what we're doing is using dosimeter tubes. I showed the picture images from Indian Head. You saw some blue boxes out there, blue recycling boxes. Those are covers, and then below there, just above the soil surface, are glass tubes, absorption tubes that measure ambient ammonia in the atmosphere, and then they do a color change indicator because of pH when ammonia gets absorbed onto the acid crystal and jacks up the pH. And so, yes, so we are looking at that, and we've done extensive work on that as well in the past in our trials. It's mostly our common standard practice is to monitor the ammonia as well. And so far, we've not had indications of ammonia swapping in Manitoba. And so that's a good thing. So we're continuing across the prairies examining this. So Yeah, so the work you talk about in terms of the pollution swapping concern is data out of very southwestern Ontario with Craig Drury, which is more humid conditions on clay soils, and quite a different ball game than on the prairies in terms of the idea of pollution swapping. And then the split applications are fairly late with onto grain corn when it's quite hot. And in southern Ontario, so it's quite different ball game. So far we haven't had indication of the pollution swapping, but we're gonna produce plethora of information for the powers that be in Ottawa to examine.
Thanks. I have a general question for anyone who wants to take it, and multiple answers, I think. What work do you see already being done by farmers in the area of climate resilience? And how does your research support practices that farmers are already adopting? Who wants to take a stab at that first?
Well, I could start, I guess, since I'm on the far left from what I could see of us. Just quickly, I think in a way, I think farmers have been shortchanged a bit, frankly. If we were doing all this in the 80s, I think there would be a different story to be told. But the fact is, from the mid 80s, early 90s, the conversion of acres to no-till and direct seeding alone, and then what that offered in terms of allowing the prairies particularly to diversify and away from wheat fallow into incorporating all these other alternative crops. I mean, is that bad for the environment or is that good for the environment? And does anybody get credit for it? No, we've ignored that for some strange reason. And you can understand why growers are upset about, carbon taxes and carbon footprints when you don't get any credit for what no-till particularly has done on the prairies.
I'll take some comments, provide some comments here on the nitrogen management side. For sure, there's been changes, and of course, in terms of resiliency, that's a long-term game in terms of reducing emissions. It helps when our producers reduce emissions because we have so much land base producing emissions. Obviously, we need other partners around the globe to also be joining in to make a big serious dent. But nevertheless, our producers are stepping up to the plate here, looking for more efficient ways to use nitrogen. So, there's been soil testing, there's variable prescription mapping testing. There's using enhanced efficiency fertilizers, be it with inhibitors or polymer coated. They're making more and more of a dent in the marketplace in terms of the inhibitor products. So, the latest data is saying that, they're about 10% of the nitrogen, if not more, is treated with inhibitors or enhanced efficiency fertilizer. That's big difference from a few years ago when it was just 1 or 2%. So it's making quite market gains there. In this idea of split application, I know several farmers that have been doing split application in Manitoba. They're curious about it, and for example, particularly what they're curious about is if they can use that the split timing to make a decision, be it to reduce nitrogen based on the performance of the crop and available nitrogen that's showing up there in the early growing season, and reduce nitrogen, or in when they think it's going to be potentially a bumper crop, to even provide more nitrogen. But it gives the farmer an extra decision point there, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to crystal ball it in terms of my nitrogen needs here for the year. So it provides more accurate, if you want to call, fine tuning of that nitrogen prescription.
Kate, think about your answer for a minute, but I think we had a related question come in to Mario's answer in the meantime. Mario, regarding the split application, biggest concerns for this grower in central Saskatchewan is no rain after the application and that volatilization. Are you saying that he should not be concerned about this if using proper enhanced efficiency fertilizer?
Well, Rob has an excellent point there. So what we're concerned about and what farmers are concerned about is that hanging nitrogen, right? That the moisture is not going to get it into the soil so that the roots can access it. So what we're doing here is we're going pretty early on. We're going well before elongation. We're at Feeks 4 and 6. The plants are still little tiny things, right? And so we're not pushing that split. So we should be reducing that chance. Now, if it's a completely drought year where there's no rain after planting, yeah. But you know what? You're probably gonna get, you might actually even save yourself of that second nitrogen application if you think it's going to be a really bad. So yeah, so I could tell Rob that we know the risk, and so we're limiting that by going pretty early on.
Kate, we'll give you a chance to respond. Thanks.
Lorianne, I'll just add, today I'm representing Curtis and Randy as well, so we're from the Crop Development Center. So I do want to add a couple things to that first question you posed. And so when growers are already doing due diligence and careful selections when it comes to selecting their varieties that they want to produce for the year. And so, high yielding cultivars, selecting for shorter or stronger strawed traits to ensure good production. Those are things that they're already doing. And so I would say that in some of our preliminary work that led to the background to conducting this wider genetic trial here was that in assessing some of the developments in cultivar improvement for shorter, stronger strawed cultivars, we do see the propensity to have improved nitrogen translocation from that fertilizer into the grain under good growing conditions, under good soil conditions that are conducive for growth. So the idea here was, well, that a lot of that crop development research and variety release that has already been happening may also indicate that we can have the potential for improved nitrogen use efficiency. When you have improved nitrogen use efficiency, then you're less reliant on excessive fertilizer applications. So you're reducing unnecessary costs associated with having to apply extra fertilizer. So I would just add those comments. And of course, when we're looking at the current research project here, we're looking at a much wider genetic profile of spring and durum wheat cultivars, so we can dig into some of that potential genetic variability for any wheat as well.
Thanks. We've had some more questions come in. Andy, for Brian, back to the differentiation between spring and winter wheat and whether there are traits that we should be thinking about in spring wheat that are unlocking even more yield.
Yeah, that's a good question. Glad to hear a plant breeder asking, because ultimately when I first started working on this like 11 years ago, I was convinced that we would need special genetics. The good news about what we discovered was that you didn't need special genetics, and we've looked at all the market classes on the prairies around that. Now, that said, and yeah, the question is, like, we thought, it'd be run in that context of abiotic stress that you might need special genetic traits to buffer against that. But the fact is, we haven't seen that. But that's not to say that, in the future, decades out, is there a flex wheat or something like that that could be developed that would be, positioned that would allow us more flexibility in when we planted. There's farmers asking about dormant planting spring wheat. That right now is pretty much a binary outcome where it's either okay or it's a train wreck, for example. And so that piece to it would be nice. It would be nice for it to gain a bit of momentum, but overall, yeah, the project's been pretty rewarding in terms of how easy it is to adopt at the farm level so far.
Thanks. Brian, I wonder if you can see the comment from Graham Gilchrist too about credit given. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, I was just trying to tee it up for everybody else to argue about, so I'm glad somebody disagrees with me. But I'll let a farmer debate that one with Graham. But I'm not hearing a whole lot of positives from farmers when it comes to some of these policies. So I'll just leave it at that.
Also, Alan was asking about other yield limiting factors too for Brian and Mario.
I'll take a stab at this one. So I know where Alan's coming from here because he's spent quite a bit of time on research looking at field variability and looking at landscape processes and nitrogen and yield and responses and so forth. So, you know, the studies that we're doing right now, the aerial extent is quite small and it's quite level land. You know, the picture behind Brian is quite indicative of the land that we're using. Chosen nice flat land. And it's a great question, Alan, because you know we know large swaths of the prairies in the pothole region have variable hummocky terrain, and we know, as you know, you've shown it. We've shown it together of high emissions in the lower landscape positions, depression areas, and very low N2O emissions at the crests, and then the mid slopes are intermediate, and yields can be in some years best at the mid slopes, but in the dry year the lower levels are better. So you know the landscape plays and interacts with the year and so forth like that. So it's a great question. You know, we just don't have enough. Maybe that's for the next sustainable cap for the Wheat Coalition is to go into more variable landscapes and do this. We are doing that currently with canola. We have a study by Brandon near you, Alan, and then we also have with iHarf as well at Indian Head, and then with Rich Farrell at the U of S, and together with Croptomistics and SWOT maps. So we are actually tackling the question that you asked there. And yeah, I am blown away by the field variability and yield between those management zones, and then also the emissions. The emissions are an order of magnitude, if not more, different between the depression areas and the so-called hilltops.
We're really running dangerously short on time, but I did want to get to Jocelyn's question about 4R management and increased understanding about matching nutrients to the crop intake. Who wanted to comment on that one?
Yeah, it's a great comment, Jocelyn. You know, soil testing is you know the backbone of nitrogen management in terms of the prairies. You know, the fall soil test to 2 feet, make sure it's to 2 feet, and to get that understanding where the starting point is. And if I had a really wet winter and spring over the prairies, then do a spring soil sampling just because you could have lost some nitrogen. But nevertheless, it's the backbone. You know, the other is some kind of an idea of the nitrogen release from the soil, and this is where we start falling behind and don't quite understand and interaction with moisture and previous crops and so forth like that. So but yeah, that starting point of a soil test is extremely important. In this case, all our studies here, we don't use a blanket nitrogen rate. It's based on soil test and based on the investigators' experience locally to then say what's my yield goal, what's my expected nitrogen uptake and demand and so forth like that. Brian, did you want to add?
Yeah, just quickly, on the enhanced efficiency side, 2 quick comments. One is like every practice, and the input cost is it's an insurance policy, right? And so how much are you willing to pay for that insurance policy? And they tend from our previous work tend to pay for themselves. I'm not saying you're going to make money with them, but they tend to pay for themselves. So what's that, you know, $7 an acre? Is that a good enough proposition for insurance and risk management? Because ultimately that's what a big part of this project's all about. And secondly to that, if we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions with them, even incrementally, back to stirring the pot earlier, why can't there be an incentive to adopt it that would, because right now adoption rates are low, to be generous. So what's it going to take to get wider spread adoption? And I think some sort of policy is needed.
Thanks so much, everybody, for your time today. And it looks like we should have scheduled a little bit more time because the questions are still rolling in, which is awesome. But we are going to get cut off here. Really appreciate your explanation of the beginnings of your projects, because we're just at the start of these. And I think people will be piqued and the interest on your findings as more and more of those things run out. So we will stay tuned. There will be more updates on all the projects within the cluster, and in particular, some getting to some really solid evidence out of these studies. Thanks, everyone. And I think we are past time, but very much appreciate everybody's participation today. And we'll follow up with a few more of these questions and comments and make sure they're passed on to the researchers. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.